Good morning, everyone. Sorry I'm late. Can you hear? I guess you can hear me. Thank you, Ariana.
Good morning. Yes.
Okay, so now I just need to set my the rest of my thing up here. I want this, this. Save. Now. Where did it go? Do you see the PowerPoint presentation on the screen?
Yes, it is.
It should say INS 400 week 11.
Yes.
You do see it, okay. Good. It's not showing up on the, oh, but it's not on the, in the class course. There's no one in the class today, so that perhaps is not a problem. Well, as long as you see it, that's the main thing. Now let me just, it looked like something was in the chat. Okay, so Mariam asks, could I correct the due date for the article commentary for the last submission for the group assignment?
Yeah, just the article commentary, the due date, it is for May 12, 2022. It must be April 12, 2023.
Okay, so
we dismissed it. I don't know. It's gonna affect something.
So I will go. I'll go and do that at the end of the class. Thank you for calling it to my attention. I'm going to make a note to myself here on my laptop, and then I'll. Just one second here. Okay. Now. Just 2 more seconds here.
Hello, good morning.
Just 2 seconds. I can. Okay, yes, good morning, hello. Who's speaking?
Hi, this is Arezzo.
Hi, Arezzo.
Yeah, I didn't get the mark for news analysis number 1 yet.
Okay, I will add the note to my class. Okay. And I will look into that as soon as we're done here.
Thank you. And
You're welcome.
also, I couldn't find assignment analysis, news analysis number 2. I sent you an email and you sent me a copy of that. Thank you for that. But I cannot see that on my Blackboard yet.
I will check that right now. That assignments.
Thank you.
I thought I. Okay, it should be there. Can you reload, refresh your browser and check please?
Sure, I will do that now.
Okay, now I need to do this.
Professor,
Yeah,
one of the dates in the project is written 2022 instead of 2023.
yeah, someone just brought that up, so I'm going to correct that after class, but thank
Over a
you.
year later.
for calling it to my attention.
Yes, it's there now. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay, so, okay, good. Thank you, Ariana. There. Okay, so I'm gonna pick up from where we left off last week. I want to give examples of how Bowder uses his interpretation, let's say, in my view, incomplete interpretation, but still helpful and I think even powerful interpretation of Hegel's notion of a dialectic to better understand immigration, the reality of immigration in Canada in 2023 in both of two aspects that relate to each other in a complicated kind of way, but both as a static thing and as a moving thing. So immigration law, for example, which is part of the reality for migrants and for Canadian citizens in 2023, and of course in 1949 and so on. But the immigration law itself is at any given day is a very, very stable kind of entity. Stable in the sense, in the material sense, that it is able to, for the most part, under normal circumstances, perform its role in Canadian society, like all of the laws in Canada. One of the ways that a legal system operates is by providing predictable, a stable, predictable institutional framework for the carrying out of everyday activities. And the immigration, like all the rest of the Canadian legal infrastructure, is stable in that respect under most circumstances. And so, in a way, immigration law is fixed, but it's also the case that immigration law moves just as part of law. It is the creation of, at least in part of Parliament, formally in Canada, as in many other countries, but not all other countries. In Canada, our laws are created through Parliament. It's the institution of Parliament. Our national laws are created through the federal Parliament. And under certain circumstances, those laws change. And what those circumstances are and what that stability is feed into each other in complicated ways that are not, in my view, and I've been trying to make the case over the course of the semester, they're not sufficient, the complexity of that interaction is insufficiently captured by the two TOO static framework, the overly static framework provided by Treblecock and Kelly. Ideas, institutions, and interests fail to capture that dual nature of both stability and movement, whereas a dialectical approach starts from the acknowledgement of that dual status. And so, and the three chapters that the news analysis assignment are based on go through the three moments. Moments is the term that Hegel used, and it's meant to, it's reproduced and it's chosen the intellectual context in which Hegel introduced this notion of moment was explicitly against the background of the development of Newtonian physics and the physics idea of momentum. And momentum in physics is decomposed into vectors. And so momentum is always moving, but at each instant, it applies its force to the matter, to the stuff, the substance on which it's having an impact. So moments are an intellectual way that physicists have of describing the interaction of forces on matter in the universe. In that same respect, the organization of the 3 chapters around which News Analysis 2 is organized, it's the first negation, the second negation, and then finally a sublation. All 3 of those, in order to be properly understood, and I think Bowder does a very good job of demonstrating it in action, and perhaps not quite as good a job at the intellectual component of it. But I think that's a secondary consideration. The news stories on which he relies to illustrate the way he intends us to understand a first negation and then a second negation and then a sublation. I think the news stories, to me anyway, it was very clear the points that he was making. And so today I want to go through the way a first negation, we can understand certain aspects of news stories as a first negation, and then other news stories can then illuminate for us. They can allow us to observe in action a second negation, and then again a sublation of that second negation. So to that end, I will now turn to my PowerPoint presentation, and I want to pick it up where I left off last week with the Persons case, which I suggest is a good example of, in a separate context, but in the still in the context of Canadian history. It's an example of the dialectic at work. The Canadian Constitution set out the conditions under which a Canadian citizen qualified for membership in the Senate. And it turned out that the Canadian law, until it was changed, determined that women were not persons. It negated the personhood of women minimally in a legal context. But the really powerful, the intellectually powerful effect of a dialectical approach is that it allows us, in fact, it does more than just allows us, it practically, but not quite, forces us to expand the context in which we first observe this. The women who, Macpherson and her partners, I was going to say co-conspirators, I mean that in a positive way, but many people don't. So her collaborators, I think, is a better, more neutral term. Her collaborators certainly had in mind the legal framework within which within which they conducted their struggle. But they very explicitly were focused on the big picture, the status of women in Canadian society. It was objectionable to them, and it was not perceived as objectionable by many, 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 many people in Canada. And I want to point out to you that this was after the Komagata Maru. So women were not seen, women did not have a legally certified status as persons in Canadian law as late as whenever it was. I forget when the Persons case was. That's a bit, well, 1929. So as late as 1929, from a legal point of view, women were not persons. Now, I want to walk through with you the broadening of the social scientific reality, of the reality, really is what I mean, of the reality of the limitations. Canada in 1929, as we must imagine, since none of us, as far as I know, were alive in 1929, none of us in this room certainly, but I'm pretty sure there's nobody over 94 years old, 94 or older in our course. If you are, terrific. My mom was born in 1929, so it's a good year as far as I'm concerned. However, as we know, women could not vote yet. Canada was a patriarchal society, one manifestation of which is available to us through the details of this person's case, but all kinds of other aspects of Canadian society implemented, created, constituted the patriarchal nature of Canadian society. Women couldn't have bank accounts, where there were all kinds of differences in the legal status, in the economic status, and in some ways, in all aspects of life. And so this first negation is partly overcome through this struggle. The status of persons generally, not just the status of women, the status of what it means to be a person in Canada is clarified through this first negation. We didn't understand as well as we needed to, as well as we could in Canada until 1929, the extent to which excluding women from the legal category of personhood meant a contradiction in our understanding of what the more general category of personhood was. Now, certainly in the case of many, many individuals, it wouldn't, a given decision in a court case is not going to immediately, and in many cases is never going to change their own personal opinion. But what it does is, in an institutional and therefore material way, it changes the social reality of that society. It doesn't do it immediately, or that real institutional material effect doesn't manifest itself all at once immediately in every aspect in which eventually it might, but it's a start. And it's in retrospect that we can understand, that we can better understand than they could at the time, the nature of that transformation. Okay, now, just try to stay on track. Right, so we saw that as a first negation of this incomplete understanding of what personhood entails legally and then more broadly socially, this first negation is, by most accounts, I think a step forward, but it was an incomplete step forward. And in the consolidation of that step forward, there's pushback. There's to the degree, again, from the perspective of 2023, that we see this as incomplete. It's available to us in a way that was not available at the time in Canadian society for the maximum effect of that first negation. Not all women were included in this, and so not yet included in the legal status of persons were women of color, Indigenous women. The women were still, the women who came to be included in the category of persons who failed to meet the existing property standard were themselves not allowed to, did not fully qualify as persons. From a legal point of view, it's worth noting that still in 2023, when you're under 18 years of age, you don't fully qualify as a person in Canada. You cannot legally enter into contracts, for example, and there's a number of different respects in which that notion of personhood has not been universalized. Another example that's controversial, that's increasingly controversial in the last 10 years, I would say, has to do with the extent to which the notion, the term personhood is insufficient, is inadequate for the purpose for which it's often deployed. So although I myself, for reasons that we need to go into, I'm not at all sympathetic to this particular movement, there's a widespread movement that's especially strong generationally to rethink the limits of personhood as they are dependent on species. And so there are lots of people who think that restricting the category of personhood to humans is, some people, you know, this has been written down and the argument's been made. I can barely say it out loud, but because I think it's very problematic and dangerous to go all the way, not the conversation, but the goal that some people engaged in the conversation claim to be struggling for, I think is on the one hand impossible and on the other hand a disaster. And that would be to grant rights, the same rights we now grant each other to all forms of life. I don't think that's a coherent sentence. I don't think it's possible as a goal. And I think it's dangerous even as a movement, but it's out there. What I'm trying to illustrate for you is the kind of directions, the range of directions that this can take from the point of view of in 2029, that nobody would not have occurred to almost anybody. Although I've recently read that in fact, it was in Victorian England that a lot of the current ideas around, or that in Victorian England, a lot of the current ideas around animal rights were already being thought about and written about, but in the academic world and even in the legal world, animal rights, the expansion of animal rights and even the equating of animal rights to human rights is increasingly being discussed. And movement has been made. So there are jurisdictions around the world, not everywhere, but it's sporadic, you know, or some places around the world, jurisdictions are moving forward on granting some version of rights to some classes of non-human life.
This is when I get to diss Peter Singer, I will gladly do it.
I beg your pardon?
This is when I get to diss Peter Singer, I will gladly do it.
Right, so the case had a material impact, the first negation was right. Okay, so now. Okay, so we went over this. Okay, so now I want to move to one of the things I want to cover today in class is I want to articulate, I want to further articulate what I went back to look at it, and he does a good job. So if you read the chapters carefully, I think you'll find it convincing. I didn't remember it that way. So anyway, I want to explain a little bit and justify and demonstrate in action one of the central assumptions that drives Bowder's work as a scholar and that drives the logic of the argument in the book or the chapters I've assigned. And that's the reason that he focuses on the news, on media stories as they enter into the dialectic of the production of the Canadian national imaginary. The Canadian national identity is in part, you know, he says it a couple of times, and it's important to always have it in the back of your mind. His claim is never that he's told the whole story. He's saying news media gives us a glimpse of one of the important factors that contributes to the production of and the reproduction of and the changes in the Canadian national identity. on the understanding that the Canadian national identity is a changing thing, it is a moving thing about which it's very easy to be led astray and to overgeneralize. But I want to pause long enough. I want to, as Hegel had it, I want to tarry with the negative here for a second. And I want us to think about the problems, the legitimate and important problems that we would need to consider in the project of trying to understand what the Canadian national image is. But I want to slow it down. I want to slow down the skepticism that could lead, if it's not slowed down, to the conclusion that there's no such thing. And the way that argument goes, well, everyone has their own opinion about what the Canadian national identity is. Therefore, there's no such thing as a Canadian national identity or the overarching Canadian national identity. And to counter that, I just want you to think about yourselves, each one of you. Each one of us has, I think anyway, at least arguably, we often, all of us individually, speak about ourselves as though we had an identity. I think we often experience that we have an identity, and we also often experience that that identity is not 100% internally completely consistent. We're torn sometimes between different commitments, the different commitments that are an important component of what our identity is. We see ourselves as, in my case, I'm a husband and a father. And so sometimes my commitment to my children is in competition with my commitment to my marriage. And both of those I experience very, very strongly as important components of my identity. There are people who, and that personal dynamic can be mapped onto all kinds of different components of each one of our own identities. Many of you I have friends, biracial couples where their children are the biological and the cultural product of more than one culture. And there are ways in which they are drawn to certain aspects of the heritages of both of their parents, and in other ways that they want to move forward the way that many children who are not children of biracial couples are also. There's a generational gap between one generation and the earlier generation. And that both of those identities are, on the one hand, powerfully felt, powerfully experienced in many, many cases, but also the source of internal tension. So to the degree that it's complicated, and it's at the very least complicated to think about our own experience of our own identity, nonetheless, both the notion of our own identity, that is, that we have one, and its effect on what we do and how we behave and how we respond to the world, both of those are available to us as a provisional starting point to consider at least the intellectual possibility of there being something like the Canadian national consciousness. Our own consciousnesses are fractured, and yet we still have one. So it follows from that it's at least not impossible that collective consciousnesses can exist also. Now, what kind of available evidence do we have for the existence and the nature and the manifestation of this national consciousness? The media offers us one, access to a great deal of information, some of which can be turned into evidence if we attend to it carefully. Okay, so the media. So now I want to take a look at what has happened in the last couple of days. And I want to take a sort of a sidestep to accomplish a couple of things. I went through and I've graded now, I think, all of the comments from the Komogata Maru video, the continuous journey video. And so last year was the first time I posted that video as part of a discussion board with the apologies. And I was surprised, I don't know why, but I was surprised at the responses by the students the first time around. And roughly the same thing happened again this year. So I'm no longer surprised, and it makes it a little easier to think about it when you're not surprised. And so what surprised me the first time around was how many students interpreted it in terms of sincerity. And so students who thought Trudeau was sincere liked the apology, and students who thought an apology is beside the point were more inclined to doubt the sincerity of Trudeau's apology. And what surprised me about that is it seemed to me, it never occurred to me to think of it in those terms. Trudeau's doing a job, right? He's got a uniform on, and it's a little bit like an actor. So if the actor can convince you that he's really in love with his boyfriend in the scene, then he's done his job. And it doesn't occur to me to wonder, well, is he really in real life in love with this guy? Or I'm watching the movie, it's a movie, and he's an actor. And when the camera stops, he's a human. And when the camera is starting to roll again, he's Jim or whoever he is in that story. And the movie works as long as I don't think about that in that scene. Trudeau's job is to convince us, and he was successful or unsuccessful depending on the impact that the apology had, both in the moment, but also over time as it unrolls. Now, where I'm going with this is that over the last 2 days, the federal government, Trudeau still prime minister, has now extended the Safe Third Country Agreement. And I think that Trudeau, I think it's a very bad thing. I'm very disappointed, although I'm not surprised. I think it was a bad decision. And I think that it demonstrates the extent to which Canada is constrained by US government policy in how we can respond. And in particular, though, it puts pressure on our claims repeated over and over and over, especially by the Liberal Party, especially by the Trudeau-led Liberal Party, about our humanitarianness. And so the way that our classmates responded to the sincerity and the challenges to the sincerity, so that one of the good things about the discussion board is that students respond to each other's views, and students who seemed anyway to, I didn't systematize my interpretation of, I sort of had an overall impression of your responses. Maybe that would be a good exercise to tabulate some of this, but in any event, I didn't do that. It's an impression I have. The people who like Trudeau's response agreed that it makes sense, though, or agreed with a claim that it might, maybe it was Amanda actually who made it. I forget who made the claim that an apology is fine, but words are one thing. Let's see what the action is.
Yeah.
And several students agreed, and some of them might have made that point independently. But now we've got an action that we can measure the sincerity of his commitment to earlier. And it's easy, and a number of students pointed out, it's pretty easy to apologize to dead people. That doesn't cost much. You can get up there and you can say, I'm sorry about your great-great-grandfather. What we're doing now is going to, just a second. Looked like someone jumped someone, but.
Oh.
Sorry, I'm back, sorry. So when Trudeau apologized in the House of Commons, for an action that the Canadian government did 100 years ago. Those of us who, part of the logic of that apology is to make sure that we never do it again. And I think we're doing it again right now with Haitian, in particular with Haitian immigrants. So, and the Haiti in particular is an important aspect of what's going on at Roxham Road. It's not only Haitian migrants who are coming through there, but in Haiti at the same time, the United States not only wants us to return them to block that access to Canadian citizenship, they also want us to send soldiers to Haiti to kill Haitians. Well, they want us to send soldiers to create peace, but what people mean when they say send soldiers, what peace looks like is dead bodies on the ground. And so these two things, I don't think, or I don't think you need to be a cynic. I don't think you have to hate Trudeau's guts. If you've watched Continuous Journey, if you've read a little bit about what the reality of it was when it happened, and then when you take a look at the apology that the government made for that, the actions that have been taken in the last couple of days, well, I should correct that. The actions weren't taken in the last couple of days. It's been in the news, sort of in the background, but for the last year, the US government and the Canadian government have been working out details for how they can close that, in quotes, loophole between Canada and the United States. And so the timing of it has to do with a bunch of different factors, many of which I'm not aware of, but nonetheless, Biden came, he was here, they announced this, and we're now presented with some evidence by which we can, for ourselves anyway, evaluate, reevaluate Justin Trudeau's apology on behalf of the Canadian government and the Canadian people for what happened to the Komagata Maru. I want to walk that through a little bit, right? Canadian citizens in Canada today, we hear about whoever we are, we Canadians, in terms of our national consciousness. We imagine that it would be impossible in Canada in 2023 for the harbor of Vancouver to be lined with thousands and thousands of people yelling white supremacist slogans, understanding that there's a ship out on the water with people who are starving to death and who are dying of thirst, and we won't let them land and we won't let food go out. That's 100 years ago. We couldn't possibly do that. We've moved forward. We're multicultural Canada. Many, many people believe this deeply. And at the same time, we've got a government that's, in my view anyway, arguably repeating that same gesture on the national level and on the international level. Canada's commitment to and the necessity. So I don't think that Trudeau has easy decisions to make here. I couldn't be prime minister, even, you know, I couldn't do it. But I don't think he's doing it right.
That's the entire Liberal Party. I don't think he's doing it right.
Yeah, pretty much. Right. So okay. So let's move on with my presentation. Okay. So I want to turn to this document that I posted in Blackboard. Now, how do I get there though? Okay, good. So this is a paper by Christian Leuprecht. He's a political science professor at Queen's University, and he also teaches at the Royal Military College, which is in Kingston. Both those institutions are in Kingston. And it's not a scholarly article, it's a policy paper from a think tank, the Macdonald Laurier Institute. And we'll just go to just to set the ideological framework for this policy source. Who do they choose? Well, it's an interesting strategy. What they've done, oh, it's not on the screen though. Here. On this, out there in synchronous land, do you now have on your screen the Macdonald-Laurier Institute page?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So it's right, so you go right, but you can't see it. How did I fix that?
Move to the tab,
I'm not sure.
the window.
Oh, I see, maybe. Okay, yeah. Now, how do I make it bigger though? It's not much help. That's wow. Oh, it's not even on there anyway. So okay, so that didn't help. Okay, just one sec here. Private display. Okay, there we go.
Thank you.
So what they do, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, it has the Right Honorable Stephen Harper and the Right Honorable Paul Martin, both former prime ministers. And that makes it look like it's a little bit balanced, but that's not, I don't think, an accurate representation of it. I would say that putting Stephen Harper on something lets everyone know what they're really all about.
I was gonna say, I don't know if I know that's the proper title for prime minister, the right?
Yes,
I
exactly.
don't know if I agree. with
Yes, it's a title. Yes, I know that I don't agree with that. But, okay, so what I want to do though is I want to, I put the wrong file up, I think. Well, I had it highlighted, so I'll just go to the place. I want to read a passage. Right, so you are on screen. So this study adopts terminology used in, wait a minute, is that? Okay, here it is. International migration. So I want to offer you I think a well-articulated account of what it is that I think dialectic can, a well-articulated account of the problem that's being evaluated in this article. Now, this article predates, like this is from 2 years ago, the Safe Third Party Agreement that resulted in the situation at Roxham. Roxham Road is a road in Hemingford, I think, Quebec, but it's on the US-Canada border in the province of Quebec. And approximately 40,000 people crossed from the US to Quebec through that road just last year. And the overwhelming majority of them were undocumented, or a large majority anyway of them were undocumented. It is not a border crossing. There are a number of official border crossings through which immigration is, from the point of view of the law, is supposed to take place. The Canadian laws have a mechanism for controlling the border. And it doesn't include people crossing from US to Canada or Canada to the US anywhere else. And so Roxham Road, the name Roxham Road is the name of the place where a great deal of this is happening. And so we'll get to what a safe third country is and so on. But I want to take a look here at the account that Leuprecht gives. International migration is a fairly objective variable in demography, often understood simply as the process of persons coming to reside outside their country of birth. And then Notwithstanding this claim that is a fairly objective variable, he then clarifies this. I think undermines it, but that's okay. That's the direction I want to take it. However, measures imposed by states to, in quotes, move borders outwards, such as safe third country agreements, we'll get to that in a bit, and inwards, such as inland enforcement. So in Ontario and in Quebec, and I imagine in other provinces, but I'm not 100% sure, there are special detention centers for undocumented migrants who've been apprehended and for people against whom deportation and other kinds of orders have been implemented. And for some of those people, those detention centers effectively place them outside the protection of Canadian law. And to the degree that they're outside of the protection of Canadian law, in a sense, they're no longer in Canada. So it moves the border inside in a way. Another example of that is the diplomatic residences of diplomats. International, so the countries with whom Canada has diplomatic relations, those countries that have permanent diplomatic status in Canada are not here as regular migrants or immigrants. They're not subject to Canadian law, and Canadian diplomats who live in other countries have a reciprocal agreement. And so in a certain way, the US Embassy in Ottawa is US territory, not Canada, in a relatively clear way about which there's a great deal of agreement. Yeah,
That's kind of like most embassies in general.
I think all embassies. Yeah, yeah. So it's not just for detention centers. This idea that the border is an absolute line, at the very least, has exceptions. And so Canada is, for the most part, geographically defined by its borders, but it's not absolutely defined by its borders. And the very notion of what a border is has come under tremendous academic scrutiny, and the ways that the border, in fact, has never operated like a wall. It's always operated more like a gate, or more like a cell barrier, actually, like for a biological cell. Things are meant to cross back and forth across the borders. Canada has always existed from the very beginning, requiring an understanding that it absolutely requires the ability for goods and for people to cross from what became Canada into the United States on the land border, but also to go back and forth to Europe. So the borders have always existed as porous membranes rather than absolutely as walls. They're walls with doors. So, so they move the borders outwards and inwards, and they've made international migration a security issue. The spectrum of ways in which migrants can find themselves categorized as, all these terms in quotes, illegal, undocumented, alien, or irregular, is complex. But one feature that all of those terms share, that's captured, the sort of foregrounded by the dialectical approach that Bowder suggests, is there's negation built into all of those words. Illegal, undocumented, alien has it built in terminologically in a marginally more complicated way, but only a little bit more complicated. And then irregular. All of those terms on their face, including alien, all of those terms on their face carry negation with them.
You're not legal, you're not done.
And the alternative, so the reality of them is not just, it has an impact not just on the people those terms describe, but on the rest of us, on behalf of whom those terms are being applied to other people. The opposite, the converse of illegal are those of us who are legal. Like the international students who come to Seneca College, they're here legally. Like they're here legally, they have documentation, and they're here regularly. Like, for example, my father, when he migrated from Belgium to Canada, I don't know any of the details of it actually. I mean, he took a ship and all that, and I assume he had whatever was required, but he got here and he had legal status, and he's constituted as not as an other that's set up by these particular terms. So a migrant's status is thus determined by the socio-political process of, in quotes here, illegalization. And the term illegalization was introduced, I haven't tracked it down to its introduction, but it's introduced in parallel with, and I'm sure consciously and self-consciously aligned with another set of categories from sociology, from the social sciences, around racialization. The idea of racialization in the social sciences was introduced into the social sciences in order to demonstrate, in order to foreground the fact that racial identity depends on difference, so that someone's blackness, someone's ethnic belonging only is available in a context where there's some alternative identity also implemented. When Malcolm X, does anyone know who Malcolm X was? Malcolm X was an African-American revolutionary and politician, and late in his life, but not, I mean, because he was assassinated at a young age, but as it turned out, late in his life, he made a trip to Africa, and he famously reported that it was only in Africa that he really came to understand the Africans that he met in Africa did not experience their blackness the way he experienced his blackness in America, where there's a dominant other population that doesn't see itself as other. They saw him as other. They were us, and he could never fully be us because of his blackness. But when he visited Ghana, Ghana at the time was one of the earlier countries that achieved independence. And so he visited Ghana, and that otherness did not structure Ghanaian society the way it structured American society. In that sense, Malcolm X was racialized in the United States. There's nothing in us in absolute terms, so that I'm not white the same way as I am 5'8". I'm 5'8" in a more or less objective sense, but my whiteness, the content of that category does not have, that category has no context except in specific historical and social contexts. So the claim here to characterize it as illegalization, Luprecht does not make any of these points. He uses the term and he cites de Geneva in particular is a very important radical scholar. Well, he's a very important scholar, let's say, whose views are very much at odds with the overall argument that is developed in this paper. But this notion of illegalization captures, let me start over. Luprecht is right that there is, or he's right insofar as there is this spectrum over which the ways that the irregularity, with the ways that the status of migrants who all the way from their journey from where they started to where they are right now can only be made sense of as a processual thing. They're not illegal, they're illegalized. And one of the ways that one of the material ways that that's captured is that one of the ways that when your refugee claim is accepted, the government acknowledges that you had a claim on Canadian citizenship eventually anyway, as a result of the conditions in which you were, but the reality is it's only made real through that legal process. You were legalized. You didn't start out legal or illegal. You were made illegal and then you were made legal by the processes. And if we think about the history of humanity, the idea of being illegal only makes sense in the first place for societies that have laws. And we can all, I think, easily imagine societies that exist with no formal legal code. And that they would still obviously have people in them, people who interact, people who have otherwise fairly complex kinds of relationships and so on. But they don't have, the notion of illegality doesn't exist. It's not in us merely as biological beings in any given location. It's a product of society. So this precarious status exists on a gradient. Migrants may enter legally or legally overstay, or enter legally or legally but overstay their permitted time. An estimated 25 to 40% of illegal migrants in the US initially entered with a legal visa. Under Canadian law as well, the International Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 protocol, genuine refugees may cross the border irregularly, though it is arguably illegal for non-refugees to do so. And in that sentence, he captures, I think, one of the unexplored but really powerful components that a properly Hegelian understanding of dialectic brings to the fore, and I think clarifies when it's understood. Luprecht here, this sentence, and I met many people fall into this, and many people agree, but what this sentence assumes is that there's such a thing, that there's such an objective thing as a valid refugee claim and an invalid refugee claim. Now, I do think that there is a procedurally invalid refugee claim. There are people who just lie. They said, I was tortured, and they made that up. That doesn't mean automatically that they wouldn't have met through some other criteria for the other requirements that are imposed, or that Canada, it's not imposed is exactly the wrong term, that Canada acknowledged as binding on Canadian society through our signing of the convention relating to the status is a UN document. The convention related to the status of refugees. Canada signed it, and it's an important component of that second negation that we'll be looking at a little bit. The repeatedly articulated and at least seemingly important commitment of the Canadian government and through the Canadian government and other mechanisms of the Canadian identity that we're a humanitarian country. Because we're a humanitarian country, we signed these conventions. Because we're a humanitarian people at the United Nations, we often position ourselves as having a leadership role in the advancement of this or that other document, whose justification is not that it's going to make us richer or more comfortable. It's justified as a reflection of our ongoing moral standing as humanitarian people. Yeah.
I'm not really sure I understand, because are we talking about how immigrants who have overstayed their welcome are considered illegal?
Yes.
Or are we talking about just because migrants are entering without permissions, they are illegal and therefore should not be allowed inside Canada, because the Canadian society does not want people who are not inside Canada through legal means?
Well, what he's trying to do in this paragraph, and what I think he gets partly right, and what I'm trying to do is to demonstrate that the or you suggested between those two categories is a problem. It is it's a category problem. Some people think both of those are obviously illegal. Some people think that one of those two, but not the other, is obviously illegal. And what he does, I think, to a certain degree inadvertently, but he reproduces vocabulary that was introduced by social science and other academics and activists in this area to call into question this very idea.
Of
And so-
illegal immigrants.
Well, that there's the illegality of migrants is an objective thing. He says, right, and I picked the starting point. International migration is a fairly objective variable, right? And we could all agree more or less that with under the right circumstances, we could get very, very, very good data on the height of people who come to Canada. Right, we would just measure how tall they are, and we'd say, well, on the day they came, they were 163 centimeters or something along those lines, and you know, there might be a 0.0 difference. All of that objective, not a problem. But their legal status can be a problem. Their legal status is, at least in part, just like all of our legal statuses. It's defined and it's created by the conventions that are the laws. And one of the ways that laws work that implements this feature of it is that if you get convicted, you can, under certain circumstances, appeal that decision. And so the first court rules you're guilty. You take that trial, you take that verdict to a next level, and that other court can overturn that verdict. So for a while you were guilty, and for a while you weren't guilty. And if they were things, right, so you couldn't measure me and say, you know, under normal circumstances, at my age, I'm 5'8" now. 3 weeks ago, from 3 weeks from now, I'll be 5'8". 3 weeks ago, I was 5'8". And that's because it's an objective thing. Whereas in court, I could be found guilty, and then we could take it to appeal. And then so between the appeal and between the first verdict and the appeal, I'm guilty. I didn't do the thing. It might turn out that I didn't do the thing, but from the point of view of guilt, not guilty, it's a legal procedure that produces the guilt or the innocence, or non-guilt, really. The innocence is a separate thing in our legal system. And so all the way down, right? There are people in prison who didn't do what they were accused of doing, but they were found guilty and they're in prison. And the legal system understands that it's imperfect and so on, but there's a certain, and the notion of guilt, I think, is all the more powerful for operating in that way. But I want to make sure I answered your question first. Okay, and then let's try to move on a bit. So, right. So what the complicated, the hard to describe, but it seems to me easy to grasp. Maybe not true. I think it's true. Point that a properly Hegelian understanding of the dialectic invites us to acknowledge, I would say, is that it's not accurate to say, to think of individual humans in specific circumstances as either refugees or not refugees. Just like guilt or innocence as a moral category is different from guilt or innocence as a legal category, right? It's illegal to steal a loaf of bread, but nearly everybody recognizes that if your kids are starving and you steal a loaf of bread, you've done something different, morally different, even if it's legally the same as some rich person stealing the loaf of bread because they don't want to pay $4, From a moral, we're able to make that moral distinction. And even people who disagree that moral, even people who might disagree that moral difference has an impact or has anything to do even with the legal thing, recognize abstractly, they recognize intellectually the difference between those two kinds of evaluation. And how we reconcile them problematically, we have difficulty reconciling these things. Many of us, we're outraged when we hear that someone who's been convicted of a crime we think is morally more abhorrent than a different crime gets a sanction that seems much less. So that someone who parked illegally, I don't want to minimize any of this. So you can all imagine your own versions of this, where someone will be found guilty of what seems like a much less morally abhorrent act, will be sentenced. Well, so there are people, there was a woman who was sentenced to 5 years in jail. I didn't track this down. I have difficulty believing this, but I saw it on the news. She was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in jail for trying to vote when she wasn't entitled to vote in Florida. But there are people who do all kinds of much worse things who get much lighter sentences. That just seems, it's an outrage. And everyone no matter where you are, if you're paying attention to that, you recognize that that disconnect between those two manifestations of a society. Okay, now, so in the same way as the notion of illegalization, in the same way as the notion of racialization, the idea that there's the category of refugee is somehow an objective category isn't supported by the facts. And it doesn't help us understand the reality that we're living in. In Treblecock's book, one of the things I think they get right, but again, because of what to my view is a far too static social science framework that they use to make the evaluation, they point out that in the post-World War II world, the Canadian government and the Canadian courts and the Canadian bureaucracy found it much easier to recognize refugees from countries with whom we had positive relations than from, no, the other way around, people coming from communist countries were almost automatically recognized as refugees, but people coming from countries with whom we had friendly relations, even if they were dictatorships, it was much more difficult for those people. So Central America is really the obvious place. There were a number of right-wing dictatorships, there are still, or again, right-wing dictatorships in a number of Central American countries. And in Canada in particular, for a long time, for 100 years now, more or less, we've had very significant commercial relationships in mining with many of those countries. And in order, I don't think, I'm not making the claim that there's a causally direct connection between those two facts. I'm just pointing out that if you were tortured in Czechoslovakia or you were tortured in Ecuador, it had a different impact on your refugee claim in Canada for many years. Yeah.
This is because the government is looking for their benefit. It's like a relation, like 70-30 relationship, like 70% which country you're from, 30%, okay, your story makes sense. Let's bring you in, something like that.
I think metaphorically, I don't think the number, I don't think quantifying it goes all the way, but yes, that's exactly right. And it varies, but that's in general, the point I want to make is that this distinction between refugee and non-refugee is social all the way down. Who's going to count is always going to be a little bit about who's making that evaluation. Okay, so there was one more thing. One more thing I want to say in order to be able to describe what this third safe country thing is and how it enters into the first, second negation and the sublation. So The challenge in recent years has been for the United States and Europe to manage migratory flows through a more consistent application of the first safe country principle. However, what constitutes a safe country is controversial, and who is a legitimate refugee claimant is not immediately obvious. Determining that status involves the lengthy and complicated application of criteria established in law, with implications for the relationship between the individual and the state. Moreover, these criteria are a moving target, but it also, and he leaves this out of consideration at this place anyway, it also involves relationships between states. There's pressure on Canada to recognize the United States as a safe country. And it's difficult for many Canadians, for a number of reasons, to even consider the possibility that if the United States isn't safe, where in the world could be safe? But the Canadian courts, notwithstanding this broader general view, the Canadian courts have in a number of instances recognized the legitimacy of the legal argument that refugee claimants had a legitimate reason to fear being returned to the United States for a number of different reasons. And on that basis, the Canadian courts have not upheld this safe third party agreement to some degree. Okay. Now. Wow. So. Now, why focus on the media? So I want to get us back to, I don't know how that's going to happen, but okay, so how do we do this? Share. Am I back on the PowerPoint now for the synchronous people?
Yes, yeah.
When, out of the synchronous world, do you see my PowerPoint presentation or do you see the article? Okay, thank you, Ariju.
Yeah, we see the
No. So why focus on the news, on the media / news? Bowder's book is a little bit dated now. His work, he's continued to be doing work on this, and I wonder how he'd write this if he wrote it today. And so the role of the news in the formation of, on the one hand, government policy, and on the other hand, in the formation of the national imaginary, or the just consciousness, has evolved tremendously as a function, at least partly as a function of the changes in the structure of the production of news. When Bowder's roughly my age, and newspapers used to be a big deal, and they're decreasingly important, even within the news framework. The news has been, in many ways, fractured to a very great degree, but in ways that are hard to describe and I think understand. Actually, accompanying that fracturing of the news sources has been a homogenizing of the content. So there's a million different websites where you get all of the same useless information, and so that makes it harder to identify a consensus, and it makes it harder to justify a position as a consensual one. Harder even than it was the case when Bowder wrote. But this, I want you first to be able to understand Bowder's argument in order to be able to be in a better position to evaluate it. The media is only one of many fields in which dialectics of national identity can be observed. Nevertheless, the media also occupies a privileged position in the formation of national identity because it has a mandate to inform and educate the general public about the activities and events that affect the nation's state. Now, I want to just pause there for a second, right? The tarrying with the negative. This public mandate is asserted over and over and over, even by those institutions that have other mandates, which at least potentially and often in fact conflict with that first mandate. CNN is a corporation. It's a subunit of Time Warner, or I forget who owns CNN, but some giant corporation owns CNN. CTV is part of Bell Media, I think. Most news outlets are
It's Warner Brothers.
corporations. It's Warner Brothers. So most news corporations are part of a multinational for-profit corporation. But all of those news outlets assert regularly, they assert that in addition to, or they don't necessarily assert it in this context, they assert this kind of commitment. So CNN over and over and over tells us that they're there to bring the news to the people and then an informed population in a democratic society and so on. And I'm not calling into question the sincerity of any of those beliefs. I'm just pointing out that they operate that way. They're widely seen by people to operate that way, even by people who sometimes question how easy it is to have how easy it is to fulfill the mandate to inform and educate the general public when the interests that drive the institution you're a part of are in opposition to that general public. So there are instances, for example, I think it was the 70s, it might have been the 80s, when CBS News made it very difficult. I think it was CBS, but one of the major US TV companies made it very difficult for their news people to study or to do stories on tobacco causing cancer because of commercial conflict of commercial interests. And that itself became a news story that the other networks were happy to run and that even CBS eventually ran. So it was in the NBC's interest as a news organization and as a corporation to point out that CBS didn't run a news story because they were making money or because of money considerations. The news operates in that reality. That's still the case. But even an organization like CBC, which is a crown corporation, it does not have profit. It has revenues and it has a balance sheet, but profits for CBC, if there aren't any, I think they always run at a deficit. I might be mistaken, but they have an important, like a very big budget that they get from the Canadian government, plus the revenues they're able to generate through all the other available means of public broadcasting. Their commitment to, or their dependence on government money puts them in a similar structural position as does CNN's belonging to a multinational corporation. But notwithstanding that fact, CBC regularly runs stories. The one that pops to mind is a few years ago, but maybe a few more than a few years ago, but early on, after Justin Trudeau had become prime minister, it turned out he went on vacation at Christmas time. He was taken on a vacation at Christmas time to an island that was owned by the Aga Khan, who is an international figure, a billionaire, who also turns out to be a family friend of the Trudeaus. Trudeau has known the Aga Khan basically his whole life. His father was friends with the Aga Khan. But it's inappropriate, many people believe, including me for sure, and Trudeau came to recognize it was inappropriate for him to accept that holiday for free from someone who is, I don't even really know why the Aga Khan has political standing, but in any event, the CBC reported on this, right? With the CBC, although it's answerable to the government for money, still regularly runs stories that criticize the government. So the mandate, because the media have this mandate to educate the public, it's an important and a legitimate source of information for those of us who are trying to understand how this national identity is formed. The news is part of that.
Well, if media outlets, just because they get money from the government, don't report on the government, then that outlet can't be considered as informing the people, right?
Right, exactly.
Because if it's covering up shady government things, then what are you reporting? You're not reporting anything to
Right.
anyone.
Exactly. You're not reporting at all.
Yeah.
What you're doing is you're producing a commercial for the government. So yes, that's the problem. And the point I wanted to make is that it's not a problem that's reducible to the for-profit nature of the ownership structure of much of news media. It's also a problem for the BBC in England, and for France has its own, I don't remember what it's called in France. France has a national broadcaster also, and in Canada, the CBC also has some possible conflict of interest that it has to overcome. But it's a feature of the media. Surveys report a decreasing confidence in the media over the last number of years. Media used to have a much higher standing. The trustworthiness of the media used to have a higher place in the popular imagination than is the case in 2023. But it still has a considerable amount of trust. And the other thing about surveys, though, is that people will often report, more often today than they used to, report that they don't have any faith in the media. But when they're asked, do they believe this or that, all of which they only had access to through the media, they all believe it. So we tend to exaggerate our own skepticism. And so it's on the news, we saw it, we don't believe the news, but we believe what the news said. And we do those, that's a contradiction, but we're contradictory beings. So in other words, the media operates at the intersection of national identity formation and the material world of news and national politics. And I think that could be, I want to maybe reformulate that even more strongly. I think that it's more than just operating at the intersection of national identity formation and the material world of national politics. I think they can be more accurately seen as several sides of one overall process. And it's taken me, again, much longer than I thought. There was a story from Maclean's. Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, he was a prime minister and he was a journalist in his youth. The premier of Quebec when I was growing up was René Lévesque, and he was a very well-known journalist in Quebec for many, many years before he got into politics. Not super often, but regularly, journalists make the move from journalism into politics. Politicians, as part of their job of communicating to the population for which to whom their representatives, interact much more often with the media than they do with the citizens. And that's dictated not by any venality, that's not corruption, it's practical for the news and practical for the politician. The media reached far more people than politicians could on their own. Now with Twitter and Facebook and all this, some of that mediating function of the media no longer seems quite as essential. But prior to social media, a politician could spend the afternoon going door to door telling the people, so it could reach 100 people or 30 people or however long it would be, could just go to an apartment building and go, hi, I'm the Minister of Finance and here's the budget, and then explain for 10 minutes. Or they could go on the news, and with a journalist asking questions, they could speak for half an hour and reach 2 million people. As a country, we're better off when the 2 million people get that information instead of 30 people in one whole afternoon. So the connection, it's not quite enough to describe it as merely an intersection. The news couldn't operate without politicians, and politicians don't operate without the media. The connection's a little stronger. The current, I forget what his minister, what he's the minister of, but Seamus, something or other, Seamus, I can't believe I forgot his name. Seamus O'Regan. He's a member of parliament from Newfoundland and Labrador, and he's the minister of something or other. But he was a news guy, a TV guy anyway, for many years on CTV News. There are a number of instances where journalists have made this, and still today there are journalists who moved from the federal member of parliament for Eglinton. She used to be a TV, she was on The Social, so I don't know if that quite rises to the level of news, but it's media anyway. And she was reelected, she was elected once, ran for reelection, she was reelected, and so she's there doing her thing. The reality of the news and the reality of the world of politics, I think, are better understood as two aspects of the same underlying, or in many respects, as two aspects of the same underlying reality, at least from the point of view of creating the material conditions within which Canadians' lives are carried out. They pass a law. So in France right now, and in Israel right now, both of those countries are having massive demonstrations. In Israel, the current right-wing government, I think they're politely described as right-wing. I think a more accurate description might call them fascists. There's certainly fascists in the coalition that's forming the government of Israel right now. But they have put forward, I think they even passed the law, but have not implemented it yet, that would undermine the oversight function of the Israeli Supreme Court over the laws passed by the Knesset. And many Israelis are protesting against this right now, and it's putting a lot of pressure on Israel. In France, the current French government passed a law. They haven't implemented it either, but they've passed a law that is going to roll back the age of retirement from 62 to 64. And the French have lost their minds. There are massive demonstrations putting pressure on this. Both of those things are, both of those laws, one of them absolutely, obviously, and another one, I think you just need to pay a tiny bit of attention to see how absolutely immediately that's going to be a problem, people will die. And more people will die in Israel if this happens. And in France, it's not quite as directly life and death, but it's close. Aditi?
Is that really a problem, like them increasing the age to work? Because I understand that they passed it without people knowing, and then I think.
No, they didn't pass it without people knowing. People knew and people protested. But my point is that what the government does sometimes will produce outrage in the population, and the population will push back against the government. I think that I think it's my own view anyway, it's always good when we push back against the government. Even I think they need to know we're here. I think it's, and I don't think we do that nearly enough. But I'm not raising the case of the Israeli law, the constitutional amendment, or the changes in the French retirement age as examples of good or bad laws. I'm raising the protests against those laws as an instance where the popular imagination pushes back, and yesterday Netanyahu announced he's going to pause the implementation of that law, and I suspect that in France they're going to, but we don't know. But sometimes popular protest results in the government changing the law. It's the law, and then the people object and the law gets changed, not always for the better, not always for the worse. there's a material consequence that sometimes emerges, that sometimes manifests itself when public consciousness is altered or affected or activated or something along those lines. Okay, so with this connecting role, so I just wanted to stress that intersection might not be quite strong enough a term to capture the nature of the material reality of what goes on in the media and how what goes on in the media sometimes results in changes in the national identity formation. And as a result of that, you get what we had riots in Vancouver to make sure that starving humans don't get food because Canada has to stay a white country. And that was partly the result of media circulating and supporting and reinforcing a white supremacist national ideology, and they did it successfully. It was widely believed by the people who were protesting that they were the good guys. Almost everybody always believes they're the good guys. Right, so this is the story where journalists turned politician, but we're gonna have to move on. Okay, so now I'm gonna take a break and then we're gonna take a look at least the first negation, and I think hopefully the second negation, to walk you through how it is, because what you're being asked to do in this news analysis is to go find some news stories and describe in what ways they're a first negation or a second negation or a negation of a negation or a sublation of that last one. So I'm going to take a break. My voice is going already. So in 10 minutes, I'll start up again. Right. All right, okay, that's fine. Okay, so I'm gonna turn now to go through the work that he does, the work that Bowder does, and the way he connects the news stories to the formation of a national consciousness, a national identity in terms of the negation of the migrant as other. So that we come to see ourselves who we are is permanently problematic from the point of view of reading this book. That's the question that the book is trying to get us to think about. Who do we think we are when we think about who we are? So in order to get in order to answer that, he says, well, let's take a look at what the media says and to see if there's a connection between what we find in the media and some of the ways that we see ourselves. And we have to answer that for ourselves as individual readers. That's one of the ways anyway that reading and books work. So as we saw, as I tried to make clear, when we took a look at Luprecht's paper at the end of the Roxham Road, about the end of the Roxham Road, the immigrant as other is always already the negation of the citizen. And as an other, that negating of the other is one of the processes through which the identity of the citizen is given content, and through which the content of that citizenship is made real, is realized, is made to feel palpable. We're part of this group, most of whom we never have and never will meet. But it's still a group, and because we'll never be able to meet them, we can only imagine it. They exist in our imagination. That doesn't mean they don't exist really. But absent being able to get into contact with them, the only kind of connection we have to those other people in that community is through our imagination. Our imagination plays a powerful role in how we organize our lives. Advertisers believe this. Everybody, there's overwhelming evidence available to us if we're inclined to doubt that, to confirm that in many aspects, not in every aspect, but in many, many aspects, our imagination has an extraordinarily powerful impact on how we conduct our lives, how we see ourselves, how we understand ourselves, how we organize our lives. And a component of that is produced in the strongest, one of the strongest versions of this is articulated in a book by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman called Manufacturing Consent. And the idea that the claim that they make is that the media manufacture the consent of the populations in formerly democratic nations. And so the book was written when the Soviet Union still existed. And Chomsky and Herman said that in the Soviet Union, the media were directly an extension of state power. Whereas in the United States, their main, where they lived, well, Chomsky still lives there, Herman's dead, but they considered a number of other sort of similar countries, Canada a little bit, and a number of other formerly democratic countries. The government doesn't have that kind of power, and the media do exist, relatively speaking, in legal terms, independently of the government. Nonetheless, Chomsky and Herman argued, the media was an important mechanism through which governments were able to mobilize consent for policies that didn't necessarily represent the interests of the population being governed. Chomsky and Herman argued that the consent of the population was manufactured to suit other interests other than the interests of the people. Either way, I mean, that I think they make a compelling case, but my point really is that the imagination plays a role, and that lots of institutions and many aspects of our reality interact through our imagination. And on page 18, Bowder goes through very briefly the one version of the fundamental nature of the dialectic from a Hegelian point of view, that our own self is constructed in our own experience through our contact with others. That's very difficult, very complicated, not necessary for, I encourage you to think about that, and it can be a rabbit hole, but let's move on. So the point I want to stress from the point of view of trying to help you see what is important in chapter 4 and then 5 and then 6 for the purpose of doing this news analysis. What he says about the first negation of immigration as danger, that's the title, and that's the example of the first negation, the way that immigration enters into and contributes to the formation of a national identity in the Canadian context. This practice of national identity formation through negation involves the construction of impassable symbolic boundaries. These symbolic boundaries play a crucial role, that symbols play an important role. Bowder doesn't devote an enormous amount of attention to demonstrating. I think he's 100% right, and it's, I think, very easy for us to turn, if we're prepared to turn our attention to specific instances of how of the roles that symbols can play in our lives and in the lives of other people, we can see, we can overcome the initial temptation to reduce symbolism as empty gestures. And the example I give in other contexts is, imagine how unacceptable it would be to many, many, many people at Seneca if, for whatever reason, let's say this was a blackboard and I didn't have my eraser with me. And for whatever reason, there was a Canadian flag on the wall, like a cloth flag. And I was doing my chalk thing, and then I saw that there wasn't an eraser. And I just walked over, took the flag, and started erasing the board, and then just threw it on the ground after, because I was done with it. It's a piece of chalk, let's say there's a garbage can. So I don't throw it on the floor. I crumple up, I throw it in the garbage, and I continue talking. There are many people who would personally find that outrageous. And nearly everybody would think, what, wait a minute, what just happened? It would be a purely symbolic thing, and that it's purely symbolic is that if I'd gone over and if there was, instead of, or right beside the flag, if there was just a white cloth and I used the cloth, and I said, oh, I guess I'll use this, and then everybody would think I just cleaned the blackboard, right? There was two cloths, they weighed the same and all that. One of the cloths had the flag, what was a flag, the other cloth was just a cloth. The flag is not just a cloth. For many, many people, not for everybody, but for many, many, many people, the flag is not just a cloth. It's something much, much more. It's not a bigger cloth, it's something different. The symbols are real in that way. They impact on people's lives. Often in small ways, sometimes in very, very big ways. And so it's in that way that incrementally, in a certain sense, the news stories build up over time an incremental symbolic barrier. And on one side of the barrier, there's us, and on the other side of the barrier, there's them. Us being Canadians, and them being, in a way, everybody else, but it turns out in Canada and probably everywhere, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But at the very least, they are not us. The barrier is permeable in almost all contexts, but nonetheless, it's, so impassable, I think, is a little bit overstated. He's quoting Stuart Hall, who in my view was a genius, but and I don't remember, probably I just never read this passage, but the impassibility of that symbolic boundary, I think, is a negotiable thing. But for now, we'll move on. Weird that I didn't notice that before. So more recently, so this again, Bowder's book is beginning to be a little bit dated, even from the, or at least from the point of view of the academic approach to these things. The reality of it, I think, remains very largely the same, but this notion of illegalization and securitization, the racialization as an important social scientific category, contentious, not accepted by all social scientists, but nonetheless widely acknowledged, was already available when Bowder wrote his book, but illegalization and securitization, these were emerging notions when his book came out. So more recently, the perception of immigration as a danger has been manifested through an increased focus on the border in its security function. And that does, Bowder identifies 9/11 as a crucial moment in the changes, as in a way, on the one hand, in a way, a crucial moment in the history of Canadian immigration law. But as he points out, and I think he documents this through the news very well, this dialectic predates this notion that Canadian identity formation exists as a result of this process of a negation and then a second negation that was available before 9/11, before the changes in immigration policy that followed 9/11. He makes the case, and I think he's exactly right, that it'd be a mistake to describe it as being caused by 9/11. They were made possible by 9/11. There were factors in place before 9/11 that put pressure on the government to act in that direction, and 9/11 gave them permission to go in a direction that they wanted to. Anyway, I'm trying to save my job. I'll save the editorializing for later or for a different context. So the border's security function came to represent an increasingly important aspect of how the government presented itself and its relationship to migration and to the border. and the complexity, the coexistence of contradictory interests and contradictory dynamics at work was made clear again during Joe Biden's visit to Canada, where one of the most widely repeated cliches about US-Canada relations is the 5,000-mile undefended border. I forget if it's 5,000 miles, but however long the border is. The undefended nature of the border defines the privileged relationship that's alleged, I think accurately, but that is claimed to exist between Canada and the United States. And it does two things, or it does at least two things. Having an undefended border is it allows us to be friends. And Joe Biden went as far as to say 2 countries with 1 heart. I wanted to barf. So it allows that to happen, and he makes the much more reasonable and I think much less embarrassing claim that we are culturally very, very similar places. I think I don't know if it's good or bad thing necessarily, but I think that part is much truer and much less objectionable as a claim. And at the same time, our economies are as closely intertwined as any 2 countries in the world, or some version of that. There's a very important economic consequence to the ease with which, so what the border is described as being easy to cross. What they mean is less expensive than it otherwise would be. Because it's less expensive, it favors commerce to the degree, and so we saw in the COVID, when the COVID protesters blockaded the bridge at Windsor, one of the problems was that they slowed the traffic, they stopped the traffic between Windsor and Detroit, and a lot of goods travel there. And slowing that down, some trucks, if they're full of food, a truck full of beef, even a refrigerated truck full of beef, it's full of garbage after a fairly short amount of time. And some goods can't be transported. They don't keep their value if they can't be transported quickly. Plus, there's just the expense of having that truck sitting there instead of moving it. It's more expensive if it takes a lot of time to get the goods and the people across the border. The US economy and the Canadian economy overall benefit tremendously from having a border that is, let's say, efficient. The countervailing pressure, though, is these terrorists can go back and forth. This is the way the argument's framed. We want a border where good people can go back and forth and terrorists can't get across at all. Our challenge is we have difficulty recognizing the smart terrorists don't dress up with terrorist written on their t-shirt. And so we can't just pick them out easily from the lineup. The clever bastards, sometimes they wear good guy on their t-shirt and they're trying to fool us. And so it requires us to be able to do both of these things that are in principle contradictory, have a frictionless barrier for all of the things we want to go across the borders that benefit us, and an airtight barrier that prevents anything bad from going from one country to the other, or anything we don't want to, let's say. Yeah.
But if US and Canada have this undefended border which allows people to move and stuff to move, why doesn't US do the same with Mexico? Because isn't it also sharing a border?
It's a very good question. Yeah.
It makes no sense.
Well, I think it's a little bit more complicated than it makes no sense, but
Makes little sense.
yeah, and the border, defended and the massive expense that it is anyway, is still very porous. And there are, I forget what the numbers are, but 20 million undocumented workers in the United States who get in anyway. And US economy is dependent on those workers. The US capitalist class absolutely depends on these undocumented workers for at least a couple of reasons. They get paid lower wages, and they're not able to defend their legally won rights in the workplace so that it's easier to abuse them, or it's easier to take advantage of them. So I think that there's all kinds of, like, I don't mean be mean to them or beat them with sticks. I mean, extract labor from them at a lower cost than you would have to spend if you treated them according to the law. And so the Mexican border and the Canadian border the differences between the two illustrate, and that's a great example that I'm never going to forget because they really illustrate very well the dialectical nature of how we have to understand or the advantage of understanding many of these concepts in a dialectical manner. The US border and the Canadian, the US Mexico and the US Canada border are both absolutely both borders. And the people who work are both at both borders on the American side of it are part of the same government bureaucracy. But the role that both play is very, very different in the US imaginary and in the US material real world. And that has to do, I mean, and not everybody agrees here about why exactly that is. Some of it's just straight up racism. Some of it is simply white supremacist attitudes about Latino and Latina and Latinx people compared to white people from Canada. Canada's image in the United States is still overwhelmingly me